Hey, welcome to Never Stop Building. My name is Jason, and while you watch me joyfully install these tenon wedges, allow me to apologize because I can't for the life of me find the first few days of footage for this project. So bear with me for a short narrated photo montage, and then we'll get back to the video of all the final details, assembly, and finishing of this walnut door. My friend has this house in Colorado, and it has this door. And the door has sagged over the years and kind of drags on the floor. And they also wanted to have something that would let more light into the entryway, which was kind of a dead space without natural light. So we agreed upon a contemporary design, but it was going to be built with traditional construction and joinery, frame and panel styles to reduce the weight of the door overall and add a lot more visual interest. The original door was a laminated solid oak, and it weighed like 1,000,000,000 pounds. It was humongous. But because the new door is frame and panel, there's a lot less mass in the panels, so the overall door is going to weigh a lot less, even with a hardwood like walnut. Plus, we were going to add 3 windows to let more light in. So I set about building it. We sourced some excellent boards of clear flat-sawn black walnut, and there were some very wide and long boards, so I can only imagine where this tree came from. I mean, it was beautiful. Here you can see on the left the 2 boards that I selected to be the primary styles. And on the right, these 2 boards would become the inner frame and the panels. So it's not that common to find rift cut walnut or something that would be called vertical grain. And that's sort of my preference for the frame components, as it's a lot calmer looking. But in this case, we were lucky because these 2 style boards had this wonderfully symmetrical cathedral grain that was really going to show off the character of the walnut. The video footage that's missing is really just me cross-cutting and milling down the rough lumber to the subcomponents, which isn't all that interesting, but in a nutshell, so I cross-cut all the pieces that overlong, so they're longer than normal. I joint 2 edges and then plane the opposite edges parallel. I'm always paying attention to how the figure of the wood changes as I take successive planing passes off. The reason I leave all the parts overlong is so that any planer snipe does not impact the final dimension. So I always end up cutting off maybe about 50 millimeters or 2 inches or so from the end of each part. A little more wasteful, but it ensures the parts are perfect dimension. And then the main styles are left much longer so that the tenons don't blow out the ends when we're putting it together. Then I use my sliding table saw to cut all the tenon shoulders for those parts of the inner frame, which you can see those here. I really do wish I had the video of cutting all these tenons. I used my home-built tenon saw to make double tenons on all these pieces. The main upper and lower rails that have to hold all these doors' weights are actually these 2 huge tenons that then split into 2 smaller wedge tenons. That gives this massive glue surface and a lot of strength with 4 wedge tenons per joint. Plus, there's like a nice little detail when you start to look at how the door is constructed. These big double tenons were too large for my tenon machine, so I basically cut the cheeks out on the bandsaw. Here is the layout for the double wedge tenons on the main styles. These are the exterior faces, so first I hogged out the whole tenon on the back side. Then I hogged out the vertical portion of the smaller tenons on the opposite side. And then I tilted the mortise machine table to the wedge tenon angle and removed the sort of angled part where the tenons would expand into as they're wedged. Once all the joinery was completed, I moved on to grooving all the parts to accept the panels and the window panes. And here I'm doing that with my handheld grooving tool. You could use a router too, it'd just be a little more nerve-wracking. All the frame components were sized to the same thickness on initial milling, and then for all the joinery work, so I just had to have one setup to do all the tenons. But after all the parts were finished, I sent them through the planer once more to make them a little thinner. So I took about 1 millimeter off both sides of the inner stiles, and then 2 millimeters off the inner rails. So there was a stepwise decrease in thickness as you got into the frame. This way, on the final assembly, there's this slight setback, which allows you to chamfer all these parts and not have the chamfer open up a gap. And it also hides any future expansion and contraction of the different frame parts. And for the inner rails, they're so short that I basically stuck all of them in a row with some tape on a board to send them through the planer. if you have the parts meet up perfectly flush when you assemble it, as seasonal changes move the wood, you might have them sticking up a little bit above the surface, and it won't look as good. Walnut looks great after hand planing, and so all these components were hand planed, smooth, and then the edges chamfered, and then we put about 5 coats of Heritage Natural Finishes exterior oil. The hardwoods, especially in walnut, really come alive when you lay on the oil. It was really awesome to see. Once the oil had set up, I applied wax and buffed the panels to bring up the gloss a little bit. Onto the glue up and assembly, always the most nerve-wracking part of the build, and sort of made even more so by the fact that some of the panels are these expensive double pane glass insulated non-compressible pieces. So not a lot of hammering to be done. I worked from outside to in, first assembling the inner rails onto the inner stiles, then installing a foam tape to both seal and center the window panes before installing those, and that can absorb any expansion and contraction of the wood over time. Once the first window is installed, I can capture that and the 2 panels between the inner stiles and we let those set up a little bit. I had to use ratchet straps to clamp on the 2 large main rails. There's 8 tenons that had to seat on the both top and the bottom. There's really no safe way to do this with double pipe clamps, and I wasn't going to buy a super long pipe just for this. And then it was a similar process to install the remaining inner rail. And the glass and the wood panel. So lastly, this is the most stressful part of this glue up. It was the main stiles. So we had 10 tenons per side, plus lots of glue, and all the panels were just slip fit because I really wanted them to be tight and relatively weatherproof, and they had to sit into those groups. So it was a lot of clamping, adjusting, fitting, clamping. I think I then immediately collapsed after this. So as a bit of reward to finally hammer in these Purple Heart wedges and lock everything in place. And with the door glued up, I can trim off the extra from the main stiles and size the width with the track saw before moving on to hardware install. This door needs 4 large hinges to hold the weight as it's so wide. And all these hinges ended up having to move from the original location so we could preserve the exposed joinery and give the hinges a solid area for the screws to seat into. A little more oil on the finished and cleaned up edges once everything has been fitted, and the door is complete. It spent a few months in hibernation while my friend finished his home renovation, but finally it's installed and it really warms up the entryway. I hope you found this interesting. If you have any questions, please put in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. And until next time, thanks for watching.